welcome everyone. I'm Zade Dames, the Marketing and Events Manager for Digital. I'm pleased to welcome you to Unraveling the Complex Tapestry of AI, What's Keeping Organizations and Legal Up at Night, our first digital webinar for 2024. Before we get started, we respectfully acknowledge that in Canada we live, work and learn on the unceded traditional and ancestral land of Indigenous people. As myself and much of the digital team are based in Vancouver, British Columbia, we are gathered here on the traditional ancestral territory of the Musqueam, Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And we encourage you to take a moment to acknowledge and let us know in the chat the traditional territory you are joining us from. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be shared with our audiences in the coming week. If at any point during the session you have a question, please type it into the chat and we'll address it at the end during the Q&A portion. That's it from me. I'll be handing it over to Jen, our Director of Intellectual Property, to get this webinar started. Thanks, Jen.
Thank you so much, Danae. And bonjour, everyone, and welcome. It's wonderful to have attendees joining in from across the country for this first of the 2024 IP webinar season and kicking things off with Things AI top of mind. And whether you're new or a returning participant to Digital's IP series, we're thrilled that you could join in for this thought leadership Power Hour. Next slide, please. Canada is no stranger to AI, having been the first country to release a national strategy and its leadership in AI excellence. With its rapid adoption, AI continues to permeate our lives, businesses, and society at large, reshaping industries and redefining boundaries of innovation. And yet, whilst having incredible transformative potential, the adoption of AI by organizations can be messy and complex, keeping organizations and legal up at night. Over these next 60 minutes, we'll walk through the current regulatory and standards landscape from national and international lenses as it relates to AI, the importance for organizations to be proactive and responsible in the development and deployment of AI technologies, and how organizations should consider governing their use of AI, and a Q&A portion to close out. Next slide, please. Fundamental to the global innovation clusters is collaborative innovation, setting the framework for projects that address cross-industry challenges while creating technology products and services that can scale across industries and ultimately across the world. Digital's IP strategy supports the development, ownership, and retention of Canadian IP through numerous vehicles, and informational sessions with thought leaders like we've today are one example of that. Next slide, please. I have the pleasure of introducing today's panel. Please join me in welcoming Barry Suchman and John Weigelt. Unfortunately, Myra is unable to join in the conversation today, but we'll look forward to have her join us later in the webinar season. Barry is Senior Counsel with McCarthy Tétrault, Toronto, and one of Canada's foremost authorities in the area of information technology, intellectual property, and privacy anti-spam law, and consistently ranks nationally and internationally amongst Canada's top IT, IP, and privacy lawyers. He is also a published author and adjunct professor teaching intellectual property at Osgoode Hall Law School. As lead lawyer in Canada's biggest and most complicated domestic and international outsourcing and cloud computing deals, he has also appeared in the Supreme Court of Canada, testified numerous times before parliamentary and Senate committees on IP-related issues, and is an advisory member at leading associations and think tanks that include the Patent Trademark Institute of Canada, Licensing Executive Society, MacDonald Laurier Institute, and the Center for International Government Innovation. John is the National Technology Officer at Microsoft Canada, leading their strategic policy and technology efforts across the country. A TEDx speaker, his extensive experience in technology, business, and policy provides him with a unique perspective of our technology-enabled economy, having contributed to many tech efforts that establish the foundation for the electronic services we take for granted today. In his ongoing work to evolve technology standards and policy, John is a contributor to the development of international standards and guidelines, national strategies, and provincial and federal legislations, and helps individuals and organizations across Canada innovate with technology while avoiding the unintended consequences that might arise. We're in for a fabulous discussion today, and with that, Barry, I hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Jane, and thank you everybody for attending. It certainly is an important topic, what keeps organizations and legal up at night. I can't think of anything that's a more dynamic, very quickly changing environment than AI. Having lived through decades of technological revolutions, from the computer events related to privacy, cloud computing, and now AI, this is probably one of the most exciting and challenging times for organizations. There's been just events happening around the world on the regulatory front. I've put together a little screen that shows just some of the many developments that have to be considered by organizations in their attempt to innovate on AI. Some of it is well-established law that's now applying to AI, like the GDPR in the EU and the UK GDPR. But there's also many international developments trying to, or that will regulate AI, which could impact many of you depending on where you're doing business. The EU Parliament is probably going to be the first out of the gate with a draft with a law that's going to regulate many types of artificial intelligence systems, as I'll describe. There is a unofficial released text, which is the latest in terms of what is available. And when I refer to the AIA, I'm referring to the latest draft, which actually is a leaked draft of what is likely to be contained in the EU law. Turning over to the United States, they have largely in the private sector, unregulated by any specific AI law, although there are many existing laws that still apply in regulatory agencies that are still active, including the FTC. The Bill of Rights from the White House is one of a landmark ethical or documents that set out ethical responsibilities. But a little while back, the White House issued a very extensive AI executive order, which is bringing the United States government into motion in terms of regulating artificial intelligence systems. So if you are dealing with or intend to deal with U.S. Federal agencies, then you really need to be on top of that, including for many of you who are in the health sector, the major events that are going to happen to regulate AI health systems. There are also state developments in different areas. I've just given one example of development in California, although there's developments in other states as well. California has a draft law, the Artificial Intelligence Accountability Act, which is going to regulate automated decision-making, as well as require transparency when artificial intelligence systems are being used. There is great debate among our trading partners as to how to regulate artificial intelligence systems. There's quite divergent approaches. This is all being discussed in the context of the G7, where they are getting closer to alignment on standards and approaches, but not on how the regulatory regime should be structured. Canada is participating in that, and there's quite a debate about what the result will be. There's likely to be a convention in Europe on artificial intelligence, largely to deal with the use of artificial intelligence as it relates to discrimination, democracy, but also safety in AI systems. Canada is participating in that and could likely join that, and that would require some legislative enactment should Canada do that. I've got one screen here from the WHO. This is not regulatory, but it is meant to highlight that there are extensive developments going on in parallel with regulatory, including in the health sector, that are helping organizations figure out exactly what they need to do when it comes to AI systems. Many of you will know that Canada is on the cusp of enacting a set of new laws. One part of this bill, C-27, will deal with amendments to privacy, which will replace our current act, and that has provisions in it that include toughening up the law with respect to anonymization of data and introducing new provisions that relate to automated decision making. And there is also a draft bill, which is highly controversial, to regulate artificial intelligence, known by the acronym as AIDA. I'm going to talk about that. The bill was subject to extensive criticism. That led the minister to write a letter to the INDU committee at the request of the committee to highlight the amendments that the government proposed to make to try to address some of the substantial criticisms. So when I refer to AIDA, I'm referring to the bill as it was introduced and as it would be enacted if the amendments that are in the minister's letter of November 2023 are included. There's been privacy reform in Quebec that also affects certain AI companies. There's a lot going on the copyright front as well, particularly related to text and data mining, and whether there should be exceptions, and whether the harvesting of information that's subject to copyright should be subject to an exception. I'm going to talk about that a little bit. And then there are...
Sorry to interrupt. I just want to let you know that your screen is not sharing the presentation deck. So it is not, so folks aren't able to see it. Sorry to interrupt you in the middle of your thought process. I just want to get that squared away so folks can see.
No, I appreciate you letting me know. I did have trouble here. For whatever reason, it wasn't seeing the slide deck. How about, do you want to present what I sent you, and I'll just tell you to skip the slide?
Sure, you can just tell me when to skip to the next slide for you.
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay. Sorry, you can carry on, Barry.
Right. And then the one example that I wanted to give you is their sectorial regulation. And one example is OSFI, which is the regulator of Canadian financial institutions, including banks and insurance companies, is currently consulting on a draft model guideline to regulate models in the financial services sector. Next slide, please. I wanted to give you an overview of what the relevance of what some of these developments are, and then I'm going to get into them. But I wanted to frame it for you because what's going on is causing a lot of headaches. So when you look at the regulatory developments, they have many different impacts. Clearly, for businesses, they're thinking about what do I need to do in order to comply. But they also exemplify, in some cases, the best practices. And when you look at the AIA in Europe, you could definitely see that a lot of that was written by experts in artificial intelligence systems. These regulatory developments affect and need to affect, and our clients are really thinking about them the way they should be, which is impacts on the entire life cycle of AI systems, including development, testing, deployment, and they are trying to accommodate the regulatory requirements, including those related to transparency, accountability, frameworks, data governance, and risk management. What we're finding, though, is that these requirements, which are driven both by legal compliance, ethical responsibilities, and frankly, many businesses wanting to be conservative to try to get ahead of what's coming, are having enormous implications in contracting, right? Nobody's alone, and everybody is contracting with others or partnering with others. And a lot of these developments are really impacting contracts, including customer contracts, where one of you goes to a customer, whether it be government or private sector, then a lot of these issues that are coming up in terms of regulatory requirements are coming up in spades in contracting, and all of the different items that have to be considered are being addressed in contracting. And I can tell you, it's just a new age, and many of you, if you haven't already, are going to find you really have to lawyer up in order to deal with customers who are now developing templates to figure out how they're what the best practices need to be in terms of contracting. We also see that in supply chain in terms of companies subcontracting to others, and then model licensing and training and consulting. And then, as I'm going to get to at the end, there are real impacts on liability, and there are very contentious negotiations on what the extent of the limitations of liability are. Customers are looking for extensive warranties, and many vendors are just saying, hey, I can't make all these promises. And so they're looking for disclaimers. So this is quite a contentious area. Next slide, please. In terms of what AIDA is going to cover, it's got 3 categories of systems that are potentially going to be regulated. There's a category called high impact system, and the way the law is being reformulated, those initially will be those that are identified in a schedule that I'm going to get to, and then later ones can be added. After the bill was first introduced, we saw OpenAI, ChatGPT, and others. And so there is the new provisions that deal with regulating generative AI systems, and it is not being regulated the way it is in the European Union or the United States. And so it's quite a marked departure, I think, from what we see internationally. And then there was a new category that was going to be regulated, which are machine learning models. And again, this is not something that's specifically regulated in the EU or in the United States. So there's quite a difference between what Canada intends to do and what we're seeing internationally. Next slide, please. In terms of what the initial list is, the initial list is identified by the minister in a letter, and a lot of the areas relate to dealing with bias and discrimination, which will be quite important to you. And areas that are identified are really bias and discrimination in making decisions related to employment or what services are going to be provided to an individual, quite an open-ended category. And then there's courts or administrative bodies, and in law enforcement. I want to talk a little bit about the category, which I know will be of interest to many of you, which deals with healthcare or emergency services. Go to the next slide. So healthcare and emergency services are generally regulated provincially, but the government explained in this minister's letter that there is an intention to regulate certain areas. The ones that were called out were triage of individuals at an emergency ward, systems that provide health advice directly to Canadians over the internet. And what they point out is that although governments themselves aren't being regulated, the systems that are licensed, sold to, managed on behalf of governments will be regulated. So I think for many of you, you may find that you're subject to potentially conflicting and overlapping regulation between AIDA and provincial authorities if this goes ahead, and that's quite a headache for many of you. Next slide, please. There will be new classes of high impact systems. Nobody knows what they are yet. The government has been extremely vague in terms of what can be added. So basically, whatever the minister wants to regulate in the future, the minister could, and there's quite a potential for overlapping regulation. Next slide, please. What risks are likely to be regulated? We don't know yet which, for example, health systems will actually be regulated. But what AIDA purports to deal with is the concept of harm, which is very broadly defined to include psychological harm, damage to property, or economic loss. So it could be anything. And then the second prong of AIDA is going to deal with biased output and discrimination, which I think is the initial focus. Next slide. Go 2 slides up. You'll see if anybody wants what is being regulated under the EU AIA, and I'll make these slides available so you can be able to see them. Next slide, please. So you might want to know, will you be regulated? And under the structure of the Act, high impact systems, which are the ones that I mentioned before, are going to be regulated by or over those people who make them available. It's not clear what make available means, but if it's licensed to a company, if it's a model that's distributed, if it's made available as part of a service, then you will be covered. The rules will also cover those who manage high impact systems. So if you're in the business of managing or licensing and managing, you're going to be caught with both prongs. And then for machine learning models, those are that is going to catch any machine learning models that are made available for high impact systems. Next slide, please. There is a category of system that is regulated and going to be regulated under our privacy law, and that's systems that deal with automated decisions. Customers or the organizations that use them have to be transparent that they use them, but they also have to be able to explain how decisions are made. And this is a problem. If you look at the CPPA, which is the legislation that's going to replace PIPEDA, there will be a need to explain a decision that has a significant impact on an individual. And that includes the sources of the information used and the reasons or principal factors. So you can imagine the source of the information might include all of the training data that was used, and that could be quite difficult in order to comply with. And the principal factors that led to the prediction, again, in some cases, it's not that easy to be able to identify that. So that will be a challenge for many of you, which means you'll have to do lots of testing and also be able to document how the model works. Next slide. There will be new obligations with respect to transparency. These have been developments that were introduced after the original bill. And so anyone who deploys a system or makes it available is going to have to let individuals know that they're communicating with an artificial intelligence system, unless that's obvious. There's going to be new labeling requirements for synthetic content, and also requirements to provide descriptions of the system, which could include a lot of different information. I think AIDA is likely to be amended significantly to align with the AIA to expand what some of the information requirements are going to be. Next slide, please. If you're going to look at one slide to keep you up at night, then it's the obligations on the person who makes available a high impact system. And so this is really going to require organizations to make assessments of the adverse impacts that could result from the use of a system, take measures to assess and mitigate the risks of harm, test the effectiveness of the mitigation measures, permit human oversight. That's very interesting to see how that is going to work. ensure the system is performing reliably and is robust, and to keep records. So these are obligations or functions that many organizations are currently implementing and negotiating their contracts, regardless of whether or not the systems they're dealing with are high impact. They're considered to be best practices, even though exactly what the parameters of these obligations are going to be. And so if you're thinking, what do I need to think about, this is a really good list of what to be thinking about. Next slide. There are also obligations on persons who manage the operations. So if you're managing an operation, then there are still many obligations and testing and oversight that need to be taken into account. So you will find, if you're managing an AI system for someone, or if you make it available to someone and you're managing it, you're going to have these obligations. But if you aren't managing it, then organizations will be demanding that you provide information that they're going to need in order to comply. So you're not done when you make it available. And this is causing considerable discussion and negotiations about these terms. Next slide. Next slide. I'm just moving a little quickly because of time. One of the new items that was introduced into AIDA was a requirement for an accountability framework for high impact or general AI systems. And this is requiring organizations to implement what is probably a best practice in any event, to have an accountability framework. And that means organizations have to document who's doing what. They have to put policies into place to manage risk. So we're seeing accountability frameworks that most recently have been introduced in other areas, including privacy, being brought into the governance of AI. Next slide. Go right to the last slide if you could. And while you're doing that, I'll just say that the AIA has numerous recitals that really describe what organizations should be doing when they're trying to determine how best to implement governance processes. Go to the very last slide. And so I know it's hard reading. The AIA is about 250 pages. It reads like, no, one slide behind. It reads just like an income tax act. But if you want to see best practices, you should look at those recitals. I want to just close on what we're seeing in terms of contract considerations, because for many of you, if you're staying up at night, you're not only thinking about regulatory requirements, but you're thinking about all the organizations that you're partnering with and you're contracting with. And you've got to be thinking about what are the terms and conditions that you're looking for, and how to address the new terms and conditions that third parties are trying to impose on you. And that is going to mean quite a lot of thought on your part. So as I said at the beginning, we're starting to see new AI governance schedules in just about every contract, whether or not it's a dedicated kind of AI related contract or traditional contracts that now have AI components to them. And so you're going to find you're going to be dealing with myriads of organizations who are going to be throwing all kinds of terms at you, trying to have best practices implemented. And it's going to be quite challenging. So we're seeing governance obligations, we're seeing obligations related to risk determinations, right? What kind of system are we dealing with here, and is it regulated or not? There's a lot of debate going on over compliance with laws. It's easy to say you're going to comply with law, but many organizations are very concerned about signing up to that. And then we do see lots of negotiation around assistance with compliance and allocation of responsibility. John will tell you that there are starting to be standards that are being promulgated in the AI area, including in the areas of AI management, risk management, and cybersecurity. And in many other types of contracts, these types of standards are often included as obligations in contracts, and we're starting to see a lot of negotiation over whether organizations will or will not agree to standards and which ones they are, and that's also quite a contentious area. On intellectual property and privacy and dealing with training data, all I can tell you is we could spend an entire 2 sessions or more on this. The intellectual property issues are quite complex. The privacy issues are quite complex. The confidentiality issues are quite complex. Organizations have loads and loads of concerns. And so we are seeing lots of negotiation. We've seen this for a while now, dealing with those terms. And then kind of just the last 2, as I mentioned, there's a lot of concern over liability because the fines, for example, for violating AIDA, right, can be 3% of a company's worldwide revenues, and in some cases they can even be higher, and there's possible criminal offenses. And so we are seeing companies that are really trying to either limit the risk. On the other hand, we're seeing pushes for indemnity. So this is a very, very contentious area. And if you've got investors, you don't want to be out of business because one contract goes bad. And then we're also seeing a lot of discussion about the concept of how one verifies or assesses compliance. In other traditional contracts, we have a certain type of audit standards, and we have rights to audit, and there's quite a lot of discussion about how that could apply in these contexts. So if you're staying up at night thinking about compliance, then I really think you need to think about compliance in terms of the whole life cycle of development right to putting the AI system to bed when it's all said and done. And then you also need to think about how you're going to be dealing with your counterparties when you go to market in some way. So I think that is the end of my time, and I want to thank you, and I apologize for going quickly, and I look forward to questions and answers at questions at the end.
Well, thank you, Barry. That was a very comprehensive view of the landscape, and certainly those of us that are tracking the legislation are trying to keep up with that pace of change. Oh my goodness, hasn't it been quite a year of change in the age of AI? If we were to look back at last January and the explosive growth of ChatGPT and OpenAI, getting 100 million subscribers in the first month, the fastest growing property, is just phenomenal. And with that growth of generative AI, it really captured our imagination. And I think it's because it's being able to use natural language to interact with a computing platform and almost seems lifelike as you're having these conversations. But let's be clear. These are simply powerful word prediction engines. Let's try not to anthropomorphize these tools as we often see in the media, because AI has been around for many, many years. I myself have been the responsible AI champ for Microsoft Canada, where we review sensitive use cases of AI to ensure that we're meeting our principles for making sure that AI is put in a safe and meaningful way. Look, AI has been around in your organization for many years through fraud prevention, Perhaps you're using some cybersecurity tools, anti-malware, virus checkers, intrusion detection. We all use wayfinding applications, grammar checkers, translation engines. You see it in credit risk, simulations, automated thermostats. And so it's important that we have this conversation around AIs, keeping these AI-infused tools in mind. Because with the media focus over the last few months, we've seen some very salacious articles that are there that suggest that, hey, AI is going to take over the world. And just before people ask about whether or not I have slides, I know it's unusual to have a Microsoft person without a PowerPoint deck, and so you'll bear with me. If I get the shakes, you'll know that it's a little bit of PowerPoint withdrawal here. Compounding this challenge that we have is that in Canada lags in trust in AI. We've seen survey after survey after survey that shows Canada at the bottom of the G7, G8 list from a trust and confidence in AI. When the one organization dug a little deeper and asked those same respondents whether or not they could define artificial intelligence, it turns out that there was only 4% of respondents felt they could accurately define AI. And so it's important that we do differentiate between the various different tools. When I was editing the Canadian National Standard on Ethical Design and Use of Automated Decision Systems, we had many debates of experts just trying to come together to talk about what were those common definitions. And we'll explore that a little bit further as we look at the regs and the rules that Barry touched upon. But it's important that we really start to look at the whole pipeline, the whole environment of AI, from the data to the math, to the algorithms, to the models that they develop, to the application programming interfaces, or how those models are used or surfaced in products, and then to product features. We can also look at data quality, the characteristics of the data. We can think about how we train these models, if they are attended training, unattended training, free range training, whether or not we look at how humans are interacting with these tools. Is there a human in the loop? Is there a human over the loop, or a human out of the loop? We can also think about whether or not these models continuously learn, whether or not we tune these models on our local data sets, or whether or not they are locked and we can't train them. And so all those things come into these conversations that we're having with customers and others as we're looking to really seize the opportunity of AI. Now, you know, this ChatGPT has come out and it's almost become the Kleenex of AI. I've talked to boards of directors, I've talked to senior leaders in organizations, and over the last year, many people have said, well, how are we using ChatGPT in the organization? And it's really a just blanket term for how we're using AI in the organization. So we see organizations going through and taking inventories of how AI is used in a particular context within the organization. And I have to tell you, many organizations have really opened their eyes to say, oh my goodness, I didn't realize that we were using AI in so many different ways. And as a result of that, organizations are now trying to put together formalized AI strategies. So what is our strategy for the use of AI within our organization? And some, unfortunately, have taken the approach, much like the regulators have taken, of considering AI as this dangerous substance, this dangerous tool that needs to be protected against, and taking very much a bottom-up approach to say AI is dangerous and we need to put up controls and safeguards in order to protect our constituents and protect our communities. That puts a drag on being able to implement these tools within the environments for the objectives or the missions of the organization. Where we see organizations be most successful is where they tie their AI usage into their mission statement or into their overall business strategy. Consider for a moment a law enforcement agency that is looking to put in place AI. In one particular example, the law enforcement agency put in a bottom-up approach and suggested that, hey, AI could cause harms and we need to protect people against it, included a definition for predictive policing. Oh my goodness, could you imagine what would have happened if constituents would have seen that? They would have jumped to the wrong conclusion and almost thought that all of a sudden we're here in a science fiction movie. When you tie it back to the mission statement of something like protect and serve, all of a sudden it changes the dynamic, changes the dialogue. And one of the things that was really interesting is the first use case for AI was to give the uniformed officer time back in the field. So they were using automatic translation from voice to text to take notes. Now, the uniformed officer typically spends 30% of their time taking notes. And that 30% of the time doesn't have them doing policing actions out in the field. If you could give them back some of that time by you automating their job, then that really helps in making the mission of protecting and serving. And so it's important that we have that view of tying this back to the mission of the organization. I also have seen this renewed focus on data. So many AIs require quality data to be able to function. Now with the first parts of AIDA on the privacy side, recognizing de-identified data as being able to be used elsewhere in an organization, and having tools like differential privacy, confidential compute, synthetic data, now organizations are looking to say, how do I drive more value from my data, given that I can now reason over it in a secure way? And we're seeing this now shift the governance from where AI had previously been located, typically in a chief privacy officer role, then perhaps moving in out of the chief risk officer function, now into the chief operating officer function, where the operating officer can say, I can use AI in a trustworthy way across my enterprise in order to take my business further, still being clear-eyed about the risk, but being able to move further down that path. Now, as organizations are doing that, they really need to get clarity on what some of these definitions are. Barry talked about this idea of high impact systems. We've seen definitions around advanced AI. We've seen definitions around frontier models, high impact, and we also see in the European Union talking about models from the amount of compute resources taken to generate them. Consider for a moment the electrical power plant. And the electrical power plant is looking to leverage AI for better availability of power systems. Regulations say that you shall not use systems, AI systems for safety critical activities. And so you can imagine that if you're spinning some sort of turbine, you wouldn't want AI to control that turbine in the first instance. But what about using the AI to do predictive maintenance on that turbine? Is that a safety critical use? What happens if someone manipulates it or gets things wrong? Then that turbine could go down and cause an issue. What about personnel scheduling? Now, if you don't have appropriate personnel in the facility, then that can cause a sensitive use or high impact to these environments. And so that first immediate stream of high impact, we say, yes, we can recognize some key areas where that might be a concern, but the secondary, tertiary type activities really are causing some consternation in the communities. Perhaps not a lot of us have experience with power plants, but many of us understand that we have a learning thermostat within our homes. Well, that learning thermostat doesn't have a really high impact use in our homes, but as a developer or designer of that device, what type of say would we have if someone decided to put that device on an infant incubator in a hospital, thinking of a way to do frugal innovation? Would we have thought about that use and be able to do that? So that clarity is something that all organizations are trying to figure out where these tools are covered or not covered. They're also looking to determine where's that line between AI tools. So using an open AI toolbox or a kit where you can do your fine tuning and your embeddings, and where is the AI enabled feature? So if I'm doing prediction in Excel, is that then a high impact system, or how does that get treated? So that's a challenge that we see happening in the marketplace. As these tools mature, as organizations mature in their processes, we are seeing some activities that help organizations grab a handle on and put their arms around these AI management practices. Barry alluded to some standards that are evolving in this field. In December, we saw the approval of the ISO 42001 AI management system standard, which helps organizations put in place a management standard to properly govern and put in place the processes to govern their AI implementations. What's fantastic about this conformance standard is that it maps and mirrors the ISO 27000 series or 27001 management standard for cybersecurity, ISO 9002 from a quality management standard. And so there's a consistent approach and structure so that organizations can have a streamlined approach to being able to implement these processes within their organizations. In January of last year, we saw the NIST AI risk management framework become published. This is based upon OECD principles and OECD guidance. And so that tight international relationship, I think, is critically important as we look to really catapult Canada further with our use of AI. And what's really great about the NIST risk management framework is it describes the various actors and participants in an AI ecosystem. What we've seen happen over the last year is AI has come out of the back room where the wizards were doing the data analytics, the mathematics, and creating those dashboards. And now it's become democratized and it's involving the entire organization. Generative AI tools are typically amalgamations of not only the large language models and natural language, but other indexes, other AI tools. And so you end up having this assembly of different AI capabilities, which the legislation and the rules haven't quite caught up with just yet. And so trying to bring that together. But it's interesting when you see the Chief Information Security Officer get involved, the human resources person get involved, the communications people get involved with these tools and their behavior so that they can have a consistent approach across the organization. Barry also mentioned the executive order with the voluntary code of conduct in the United States, where a number of companies have signed up to being able to do proper risk management, sign up to this risk management framework and put in place other controls. Canada has a very similar generative AI code of conduct that many organizations have signed up to. And just recently, the United Kingdom the government published Her Majesty's guidance on generative AI, which is a very great resource to be able to guide these organizations. And so from there to operationalize these capabilities, we see impact assessment tools, responsible AI standards being published out in the community. In Canada, we've had an algorithmic impact assessment tool from Treasury Board Secretariat and the federal government for some time. San Francisco has published their impact assessment. There's an algorithm charter from New Zealand. Microsoft has published an impact assessment guide. So a number of tools to help you then get a sense of what risk is involved with these communities and to be able to roll that out. As we look at organizations that are building out these AI tools, it's been really interesting to watch the evolution and towards success. And so some of the key features for success are one, to build an AI culture in your environment and get people using the tools. I can't tell you the number of times we go in to have conversations with communities where people haven't had the chance to kick the tires of even the consumer available tools to understand the capabilities. Many times people far overestimate what these tools can do and their capabilities. And once you start to use them, then you recognize that, hey, these tools are very good at summarization, perhaps filling a blank sheet of paper with context, perhaps being able to develop code as well, those types of things. But they're really not sentient and going off on their own accord. And so it's important that we have people that kick the tires and understand that, build that culture into the organization. What's been really enlightening is, especially in academic settings, but organizations are rethinking the jobs that need to be done. And so as AI complements human ingenuity, creativity, critical thinking, now they're able to look at and say, well, what is actually being done by this particular individual in the academic setting, education setting? Educators have had some time around the pedagogical studies for individuals, and COVID really helped them along about rethinking how they teach our young people in the institutions. And so snapping in these AI tools into that is something that they're doing very, very quickly. I was on a panel a couple of weeks ago with a computer science lecturer professor from Simon Fraser University, and they indicated that this year they allowed their students to use copilots to be able to generate code. And believe it or not, the GPA average did not change from last year with no copilot to this year with copilot. And so it was really intriguing to see that, look, these tools had helped students, but at the end of the day, they didn't change on the marks and the outcome. The last thing that I'd leave you with is that, look, we see AI being implemented not as an oracle over all types of solutions or all decision-making. In many cases, particularly in the insurance companies, but also financial services, we see AI being able to streamline some of those easy cases. So in the insurance underwriting area for claims assessment, some insurers are putting in AI for those silly, simple claims. So that first 15% where, of course, the tree fell on the car from a storm, we're going to underwrite that to particular claim. Let AI streamline that process, and then let individuals do the really complex stuff where you need that judgment, where you need that critical thinking. Maybe next year, the percentage that AI covers is 17, 20 incrementally, but allowing people to do that. So there you have very, very rapidly, some of the things that we're seeing happening across Canadian industries, how they're building out these tools, and what are some of those considerations that they have as they're deploying these tools.
Thank you, Barry and John. Just kind of tugging on a few of the things that you have both spoken about, and as something that comes through the chat. So maybe John, kind of continuing a little bit to what you said, and then open it up to Barry as well. From the education standpoint, one of the questions that sort of come in is, sort of that need to be cautious, as you're looking at bringing in things like ChatGPT into education, and these connections between bias, discrimination, and what that may look like, in an evaluation of a classroom, helping how a teacher helps the students, for example. How, from your lenses both, do we make sure sort of that equity gap doesn't grow further in the classroom? And Barry, if you also, after John, have some insights around that from an education standpoint.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. And, one of the things that we believe deeply in is making sure that we build in the responsible AI into our offerings in this area to make sure that, hey, these tools respond appropriately to those questions and they're not leaving out important demographics. So if we have Indigenous students that are asking about their history, that they're getting the right expected answers from there. Providing these tools so that they're available to all as much as possible is an important element to us to ensure that these tools are available for our youngest people that have a safe place to use these tools as well. But it is an ongoing challenge that we continue to face as we roll out these systems.
Yeah, I'll just add two things. I agree with John. I think the first is the data handling and ensuring that the data is unbiased and that it is going to ensure that you have equal treatment, taking into account the disparate nature of the community that you have. And then the other is testing, right? To be sure, testing and monitoring, to be sure that it actually is working the way it's supposed to have the outcomes that you would expect. If it doesn't do that, it's going to be real problematic.
And Barry, if I can also just ask you to touch upon, I know that you didn't have a chance, we were skipping through a bit of it around sort of the generative AI sort of and the copyright, and related sort of in principles around that. So, from an education standpoint, but I think more broadly, sort of from an organizational standpoint, this sort of more, adoption of Gen AI in the org, do you have sort of some nuggets to share with the audience around that?
Yeah, I do. So the sources of data that are used for training, both particularly for generative AI, but not limited to generative AI, are really the source of a lot of confusion, because the law was never designed in order to deal with developments like artificial intelligence, including generative AI. The challenges in copyright particularly relate to training data and whether organizations can take data, even if it's, might be publicly available. That doesn't mean from a copyright perspective there's a consent to use it. Publicly available does not mean there's consent. And there is a fair dealing exemption in Canada that could apply. And there's also another specific exemption dealing with making temporary reproductions for a technical process that might apply. The government is currently looking at and seriously considering a text and data mining exception. I can say for there's been a spectrum of comments that have gone into ICED. From the AI community point of view, they want to see certainty, and they're looking for an exemption so that training can take place in Canada. Some organizations have decided they're doing their training in the United States, where the fair use rules are considered to be broader and where there's more certainty. And they want to be sure that there's a level playing field in Canada, that the bigger companies and the smaller companies can all do training here. So that's one area that if you are doing training, you have to really consider whether there's an exception that applies and where you want to conduct the activity. The other part I'll just mention is in the privacy part that I think is a problem. The privacy commissioners have taken the view that all of the traditional privacy rules apply. One of those includes getting consents. And as we know, it's very difficult in many cases in the health sector and others in order to get consent. The government is trying in the CPPA to introduce a new exception for legitimate interest, but the way it's drafted is flawed. It is seriously flawed and needs to be fixed in order to ensure that there can be responsible training in Canada. And there's also some principles that are problematic. So those two areas for training, copyright and privacy, are ones that should be keeping organizations up at night.
If I could just add two little notes to that, Barry, I think one of the things is to get out of the mental frame of reference of cutting and pasting. Often what's thought of is when these results come back, they're generated on the fly. These aren't cut and paste from existing training material. And so that then might have a nuance on the conversation on the legal side. I'll leave that to my legal community to decide. I think the other thing that's really something to watch is this idea of opting out of the training models. And so a number of organizations that are perhaps more versant with these tools and understanding the risks associated with these tools are putting up a flag or setting a flag to say, don't train on the data that I've had here. That can create challenges downstream and a snowball effect. So if you think of those communities that are putting up the flag to say, don't train on my data, they're often underrepresented in the body of knowledge that is being trained upon over the internet. And so by opting out of having that information indexed and trained, now all of a sudden you compound the problem, and that underrepresented group, maybe even further underrepresented as they start to use these tools. And so we need to guard against those types of challenges as well.
And, you know, just in terms of the risks, there's currently 16 class action in the United States relating to copyright infringement on training. And with the exception of one case involving Thomson Reuters, they're all situations where the massive training were done on pirated data sets and clearly without authorization. So that's the, that's the first series of cases that the series we're going to see next are those that are trained on materials where people have not opted in, but they're not pirated copies. So we're in for a lot of litigation, and I think eventually we're in for going to be seeing law reform. If anyone goes back to Sean Fanning and Napster, the creative community saw that as an existential threat. Creative industry sees what's going on here as an existential threat. AI companies say, well, wait a minute, being able to train is existential to us, right? So you have these two very, very difficult polar policy perspectives. And, right now the government is trying to sort this out, but there is going to be, I think, a decade of litigation until things settle down. In the meantime, many organizations are, sheltering under umbrellas like Microsoft's indemnity for generative AI, and you've got all the major generative AI companies who stepped up and provided indemnities. They're all subject to, certain qualifications. So for most users, right, there's going to be protection under those indemnities. But for companies that are doing training, those are the ones that are likely to be subject to litigation.
Thank you. Another question that's come in is sort of around approaches organizations sort of are following around sort of the validation and compliance piece. So sort of from your lenses, are you seeing sort of the primary focus on the development of new systems or a review or audit of existing systems? And if you just wanted to speak to a moment around sort of the processes around that.
John, did you want to go first?
Sure. Just a short answer is that where we've seen AI used in the past, that's been governed by statute or legislation that's been reviewed and put in place. So when we think about the Office of Superintendent Financial Institutions, the E23 requirements, model risk management, organizations have been doing that for years, and so they're doing that. And then certainly it's the new systems that are getting that scrutiny because they see them front and center, and they want to understand and appreciate, what their compliance requirements are. I expect to see them go back and look at some of their existing systems. That's why the inventories are being made, to see what's covered under the broad nets of the impending legislation.
Yeah, I see both. I see a lot of activity in new systems where people are looking at it and figuring out what they need to do. But even on like OSFI, this is a new guideline that's going to apply to models, and so it's going to force financial institutions to revisit. And then when and if AIDA comes in, there's going to have to be revisiting of a whole bunch of things, including, does this do automated decision making? How, what new terms, what are we going to need to do to be sure we can have explanations? In the existing world, if someone applies for a loan, they either get it or don't get it, and there is very little requirement for transparency. All of a sudden, we move to a new AI world, and there's a call for transparency, but doesn't exist in the in the current world. Maybe that's a good thing as a matter of policy, but it is requiring organizations to go back and look at what they're doing, because they have to now if they have to revisit whether the systems they're able to comply with existing law with their current systems.
And as we kind of look to close things out, wanted to leave with you both perhaps, two parts to a question around, from your perspectives, what should organizations, regardless of size, regardless of sector, be telling their employees and contractors in terms of how they should be using AI, and if there's sort of, a prioritizing for a best practice or a key takeaway, that you'd like to leave with your audience, sort of as a capstone to that, to each of you. So Barry, I'll start with you, and then we'll give it to John.
Sure. So let me give you a couple. So the first, I think, is to follow ethical guidelines and standards. That's going to reduce risk and most likely result in systems that are robust and help with regulatory compliance. Under that, data handling is really I think at the top of the list, because it's needed both for privacy and regulatory requirements. The initial stages of regulation are focusing on bias. So focusing on bias and discrimination in systems, I think, is really important. This is one area where you've got to make sure that there's CLE, continuing education of employees and contractors with best practices, because these practices are moving at a really quick pace. Organizations have to realize the accountability, and so all the models of accountability that apply in other areas of developed organizations have to apply. And then, just from my perspective, thinking about Canada, I'll just add, it's not quite, Jen, answer your question, but the importance of innovating. Like, there is almost no industry that's more important to Canada right now than AI. And there's just huge global competition among our trading partners to be leaders in artificial intelligence. And we have to do everything as a country and as organizations to ensure that we innovate. CG had a good op-ed today about appointing a new minister specifically of AI because of the importance to the economy. And so I think that's hugely important. And then, although John didn't quite put it this way, I think we have to be really careful about the regulation we put in place, or the regulations we threaten to put in place. If we hamper innovation in this country, then we are going to be facing decades of decline. And this is one area where if you don't get on top, then you don't develop the ecosystem. You don't develop the ecosystem, then you don't develop all of the benefits. And so we have to be very, very cautious. And, I'll just close in saying, I think we should be telling our organizations that they need to be active in terms of ensuring that AIDA, whatever its manifestation is going to be, doesn't hinder innovation. We need a thriving ecosystem, and all the people who are listening here are stakeholders ensuring that that's going to happen. And I have very grave concerns that we're going to get this wrong. And in the interest of, promoting innovation by creating safety zones, we're going to be inadvertently doing things that are going to hamper innovation. And that could be very, very serious for Canada. So that was just one little ad, Jen. I apologize for going on.
Here, Barry. I can't pile on enough onto that message to the community. That's certainly something that I really feel strongly about, that AI is going to really help improve the productivity gap that we've been experiencing for years, and then help catalyze that. Let me just focus on the people as a final word, and let's focus on people within the organization, the importance of the critical thinking, the decision-making, the judgment that our people have. This is sometimes overblown around AI will take your jobs. If you use the AI lately, you'll realize that, look, there's a lot of judgment required in those responses, and able to take care of that. The last piece is tying AI to your mission, tying AI to your corporate strategy, to make sure that, hey, AI is there to catalyze the work that you do and not replace it. And it's not something dangerous that you always have to put these firm guardrails around. Let's innovate together and take Canada further.
And speaking of people, before I hand it off to Zane to close us out, a huge shout out on behalf of Digital, on behalf of everybody that's on this call, for taking time to share this with us and really kickstarting this dialogue that is, one of many as we're going to go through the series this year. And really having folks to be able to understand, what there are challenges, yes, but also to kind of look at what the opportunities are around all this. So huge thanks to you both, and look forward to continuing this conversation over the course of the year. And now with that, Zane, I pass it back to you.
Thanks, Jen. Thank you once again for joining the webinar today, hosted by Digital and our wonderful Director of IP, Jen. The recording of this webinar will be available on our YouTube channel and website, and all those attending today will receive a follow-up email in the next couple of days with any resources discussed throughout the session, that's including Barry's presentation. And that's it from Digital, and we'll see you at our next webinar session in February. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.